In a quiet neighborhood in New York, nestled among rows of brick houses and tree-lined streets, the local high school seemed to embody the typical bustle of teenage life. Every morning, students in their standard uniforms filled the halls, navigating between classrooms and lockers, exchanging gossip and sharing stories about their lives. The sounds of slamming lockers, the ringing of bells, and the chatter of friends made up the backdrop of daily life. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Just another high school where students came to learn, socialize, and grow. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic world, something dark and insidious was brewing. The protagonist of this story, Emma, was a 16-year-old girl who had always stood apart from her peers. From a young age, she had been outspoken and fiercely passionate about the things that mattered most to her. But there was one issue that stood out above all others: Emma's unwavering commitment to feminism. She was deeply invested in the idea of gender equality, fairness, and justice, and she couldn't understand why others didn't share her sense of urgency. Her conviction was admirable in many ways, but it also set her apart in a world that wasn't always receptive to her ideas. While other students were content to blend into the crowd, following the norms and expectations of their peers, Emma constantly challenged the status quo. She wasn't afraid to speak out against things she perceived as unjust, often at the cost of alienating herself from those around her. Emma's voice was loud, her opinions firm, and her passion for equality undeniable. She wrote articles for the school newspaper about gender inequality, participated in protests for women's rights, and even organized discussions on feminist theory for those interested. Emma believed deeply in her cause, and she felt that it was her responsibility to help others see the truth about the world they lived in. Her beliefs were a source of strength for her, and she drew comfort from knowing that she was standing up for what she thought was right. She didn't care if people disagreed with her. She was used to being the odd one out. But despite her strength and determination, Emma's ideas were not always met with the respect and understanding she thought they deserved. For Emma, the rejection she faced from her peers was the hardest part of her journey. She believed that her classmates simply didn't understand the importance of her views, that they were too caught up in their own worlds to see the bigger picture. Many of the students at her high school, particularly the boys, saw her as an annoyance. They dismissed her ideas as extreme, mocking her in subtle and sometimes overt ways. The girls, too, had their own set of expectations, many of them more interested in social status or relationships than in the issues Emma cared about. They often rolled their eyes when she spoke about gender equality, or laughed when she made a passionate point during class discussions. To them, Emma's ideals were simply another way of trying to stand out, of drawing attention to herself in ways they didn't understand or approve of. At first, Emma brushed off the dismissals and laughter. She knew that change didn't happen overnight, and she was willing to fight for what she believed in, no matter the cost. But as time went on, the mocking grew more intense. Her peers began to actively ridicule her, calling her names and questioning her commitment to feminism. They joked about her passion, making crude remarks about her beliefs. It seemed as though no matter what she did, Emma was never going to be accepted. This rejection, which started as a simple difference of opinion, began to take a toll on her. The more she tried to explain herself, the more isolated she became. The laughter and mocking became louder, more frequent, until Emma felt like an outsider in her own school. The pain of being misunderstood began to manifest in unexpected ways. Sarah, once a girl with a fire in her heart, began to feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She no longer found the same joy in participating in class discussions, and the once energizing protests and rallies felt hollow in the face of the constant ridicule she faced from her peers. Emma, who had once been driven by a sense of purpose, now found herself questioning everything. Was it worth it? Was it worth the loneliness, the isolation, the constant feeling of being an outsider? These thoughts began to gnaw at her, eroding her sense of self-worth. As the days turned into weeks, Emma's mental and emotional state began to deteriorate. Her once unshakable confidence was replaced by anger and bitterness. She couldn't understand why people couldn't see what she saw, why they couldn't understand the importance of her fight. The pressure to conform, to fit in with the very people who had mocked her, was overwhelming. It became harder and harder for Emma to keep her composure, to pretend that everything was fine, when deep down she felt more and more lost. Her relationships with her friends became strained. The conversations that once felt natural now felt forced, and Emma began to retreat further into herself. The only thing that seemed certain in her life was her conviction, her belief in feminism, and her desire to stand up for what was right. But as the rejection from her peers grew, that belief began to feel like both her strength and her curse. It was during this time that Emma's thoughts began to take a darker turn. She started to fantasize about what it would be like to make people see her, to force them to understand the weight of her beliefs. She had always fought for equality, for justice, but now she felt as though the world had forced her into a corner where violence was the only way to make her voice heard. The more she faced rejection, the more her anger built. Her internal conflict, the battle between her desire to be heard and the rage that simmered inside her, began to consume her. The tragedy that followed was not something Emma could have predicted, nor anyone who had watched her struggle. What began as a desire to make others understand her views, to force them to see the importance of equality and justice, grew into something darker. Emma, the passionate girl who had once stood up for what she believed in, found herself lost in a storm of emotion, unable to break free from the chains of isolation and rejection. And when the day came when Emma finally snapped, no one could have imagined the catastrophic consequences that would follow. Emma had always been the kind of person who could never stay silent, especially when it came to her deeply held beliefs. From a young age, she had been taught to stand up for herself, to be confident in her convictions, and to challenge the norms that she felt were unjust. Her feminism was not just an idea for her. It was the foundation of who she was. She was driven by a desire to bring about change, to expose the inequalities in society that she saw all around her. She recognized that the world was full of systems that oppressed women, systems that limited opportunities, denied voices, and reinforced harmful stereotypes. These systems, to her, were a constant reminder of the injustice that needed to be fought against. To Emma, her school environment was no different than the larger society. It was another battleground where gender roles were reinforced, where boys and girls were expected to behave in certain ways, where women were constantly told to be less, to shrink, to fit into narrow definitions of what was acceptable. She saw this every day, in the way her male classmates treated their female peers, in the way teachers unknowingly perpetuated outdated gender norms, and in the way everyone seemed to ignore the subtle but powerful messages that society sent about what women should or shouldn't do. But Emma wasn't the type to remain passive. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just sit quietly in the back, pretending that everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. She began speaking out. She joined school discussions, raised her hand during lectures, and participated in activism when she could. She read books, wrote essays, and spent hours researching the issues that fueled her passion for equality. She would challenge her teachers when they made biased remarks, question the lack of female representation in the curriculum, and talk about gender equality whenever she could. She knew it wasn't enough to simply know what was wrong. She needed to make others see it too. Her mission was clear: to make her peers aware of the systemic issues that many of them either ignored or took for granted. But instead of being celebrated for her passion, Emma found herself mocked. Her classmates didn't see the same importance in the things she believed in. They laughed at her, dismissed her ideas as radical and extreme. Whenever she voiced her opinions, they would call her names like feminazi or man-hater. The boys in her class would snicker behind her back, making jokes about her seriousness and her refusal to laugh off the things they said. The girls weren't much better. They rolled their eyes whenever Emma spoke up, dismissing her views as unnecessary or out of touch. To them, she was just another girl who wanted to stand out for the wrong reasons, someone who was trying to make a big deal out of things that weren't really that important. This rejection, this constant ridicule, began to weigh heavily on Emma. What had once been a source of pride, her feminism, had now become a mark of shame. It was as if her peers had decided that her beliefs weren't valid, that they were too extreme to be taken seriously. Emma began to feel isolated, like the only one in the room who cared about the issues she spoke about. She started questioning whether it was worth it to keep fighting for something that no one seemed to understand or appreciate. Her anger, which had once fueled her passion, now felt like an overwhelming burden. The more she tried to explain herself, the more her classmates dismissed her, and the more the anger grew. Her attempts to defend her views were met with eye rolls and sarcastic comments. They would tell her to lighten up or stop being so serious, brushing off her arguments as if they didn't matter. Emma was frustrated, but what hurt the most was the way they didn't even try to understand her perspective. It was clear that they weren't willing to take her seriously, that they didn't see the importance of what she was trying to say. She wasn't just challenging their ideas, she was challenging the very systems they had grown up with and taken for granted. But for them, her voice was just an annoyance, a loud protest in the middle of their comfortable lives. They didn't care about what she had to say, and with each dismissal, Emma's sense of isolation grew stronger. The more the ridicule continued, the more Emma began to internalize the rejection. She started doubting herself, questioning whether she was making too big a deal out of things. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was just overreacting, making things more complicated than they needed to be. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She knew the issues she cared about were important, but every laugh, every dismissive comment chipped away at her confidence. She felt like she was fighting a battle that she couldn't win, a battle where no one was willing to listen, no one was willing to consider her perspective. As time passed, the weight of the constant mockery and rejection took its toll. Emma became more withdrawn, less willing to engage in conversations where she knew her views wouldn't be respected. She started to second-guess herself, unsure of whether it was worth it to keep pushing for change when it seemed like no one else cared. She tried to focus on her studies, to immerse herself in other aspects of her life, but the anger and frustration were always there, simmering beneath the surface. She couldn't escape the feeling that the world around her was broken, that the systems of inequality were too entrenched for one person, one voice to change. But despite the constant rejection, Emma's commitment to her beliefs didn't falter. Even in the face of ridicule, she refused to back down. She knew that the fight for equality was bigger than her classmates' mockery. It was bigger than their inability to understand. And yet, as the ridicule intensified, Emma began to feel a sense of futility creeping in. What was the point of speaking out if no one was willing to listen? What was the point of standing up for what she believed in if her peers were going to laugh at her and call her names? The more she tried to make a difference, the more she felt like she was shouting into the void. The pain of being misunderstood began to consume her, and Emma found herself questioning not just her role in the school, but her role in the world. Was she fighting for something that was impossible to change? Was her voice really just a nuisance, an irritation to those around her? The person who had once been so confident, so passionate, was now struggling to hold on to the very beliefs that had shaped her. The rejection, once just an external force, had begun to seep into her own mind, eroding her sense of self-worth. And in that growing sense of frustration, something inside Emma snapped. The relentless mocking, the constant rejection, the isolation, everything she had endured for so long began to feel like too much. The anger, once a catalyst for change, now became something darker, something that Emma could no longer control. The world that had rejected her, the peers who had laughed at her, became targets in her mind, and she began to imagine a way to make them all listen, to make them feel the same way she had. What started as a passionate fight for equality had slowly twisted into a desperate need for recognition, for respect, and for revenge. As the mocking continued, Emma's frustration grew more intense, settling deep into her soul like a heavy weight that she couldn't shake. What had once been a passionate drive for feminism, a movement that fueled her to take action and speak up, was now beginning to morph into something darker, something she didn't fully understand. The fire inside her, which had once been so bright and energizing, was slowly being consumed by the overwhelming anger that had begun to boil over. Each laugh, each dismissive word from her peers felt like a personal attack, eroding her confidence and her ability to see the good in the fight she had so fervently believed in. Emma had always believed in the power of words and ideas, thinking that if she could just explain the importance of equality, people would understand. But the more she tried, the less they seemed to listen. Her peers laughed at her, called her names, and mocked her for being too extreme or too radical. They didn't take her seriously, and the deeper the rejection went, the more she felt isolated. It was as though no one could see what she saw. No one could understand the importance of the fight she was engaged in. She felt alone in a world that refused to listen to her and her beliefs. The isolation grew more profound with each passing day. The girl who had once stood proudly in front of her classmates, eager to share her views on gender equality, was now retreating into herself. She no longer wanted to be around the people who laughed at her, who dismissed her voice, and who saw her as a problem. The classroom, which had once been a place where she tried to spread her message, now felt like a battleground, a place where every word she spoke was met with mocking glances and smirks. Emma started to feel as though her very identity was under attack. It wasn't just her ideas that were being rejected, it was her whole self. The person she was, the things she stood for, were being trampled upon in a world that seemed to care little for her perspective. At first, Emma thought that her peers simply didn't understand. She believed that if she could just explain her views more clearly, they would see the importance of the things she was fighting for. But with every failed attempt to get through to them, her perception of the world around her shifted. She began to see her classmates not as misguided or ignorant, but as enemies, people who were too blind, too complacent, or too selfish to see the truth she was desperately trying to share. They didn't just laugh at her opinions. In Emma's mind, they were laughing at the very ideals of justice and equality. The ridicule was no longer just an insult. It was a direct attack on the values she held dear. The more they rejected her, the more she began to believe that they were not simply misunderstanding her, they were actively opposing everything she stood for. The anger that had once been channeled into a desire to educate and enlighten now began to transform into something far more dangerous. What had started as a wish for understanding, a yearning for acceptance, became a thirst for revenge. Emma no longer cared about changing people's minds. She wanted to make them feel the same sense of powerlessness and rejection that she had felt. The frustration that had built up inside her now began to fuel a darker, more destructive thought process. She started imagining a world where those who had mocked her, those who had ridiculed her beliefs, would no longer be able to silence her. In her mind, she began to fantasize about a scenario where she could finally make them listen, where they would understand the true power of her voice, but not through words. Through action. This thought began as a fleeting fantasy, a passing daydream that Emma tried to dismiss, but as time passed, it became an obsession. The more she thought about it, the more real it felt. Her anger, her pain, and her frustration began to take shape, and she started to see her classmates not just as ignorant people, but as people who were standing in the way of her truth. To her, they were the ones holding back change, mocking the very idea of equality, and she began to believe that if they wouldn't listen to her through words, then they would have to listen through force. The desire to make them understand, to make them feel the weight of her beliefs, grew stronger. Emma began to see her school not as a place of education, but as a battlefield, a place where her fight for justice and equality would have to be won by any means necessary. The anger within her swirled like a storm, and every encounter with her peers, every laugh, every sneer, only added fuel to the fire. She began to withdraw even further from her classmates, retreating into herself, away from the constant ridicule and rejection. Her mind, once consumed with thoughts of equality and fairness, was now filled with violent thoughts of revenge. She started to plan, imagining what it would be like to silence those who had made her feel so small. The line between right and wrong blurred in her mind as the desire to make her voice heard overtook her sense of morality. Emma, who had once dreamed of a world of equality and peace, now envisioned a world where her classmates would understand the weight of her passion, whether they wanted to or not. The fantasy of revenge consumed her. Emma began to plan her actions, methodically thinking through each step of what she would do to make her classmates listen. The school, which had once been a place where she tried to find her voice, had now become her battleground. In her mind, she could see the exact moment when her classmates would finally stop laughing at her, when they would finally see the importance of her beliefs. The more she fixated on this idea, the more real it became. She no longer saw the school as a place to learn and grow. It had become the stage for a confrontation, a final reckoning. As the days went on, Emma's internal conflict intensified. She no longer cared about being understood or accepted. What had once been a genuine desire to educate and fight for equality had morphed into something darker, something that no longer had any connection to her original beliefs. The drive to be heard, to make an impact, had turned into an uncontrollable need for power, for control. The more she thought about her classmates' laughter, the more it seemed like an obstacle that needed to be removed. Emma had crossed a line, and she didn't know how to stop herself. The school, once a place of hope and potential for Emma, had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It was a reflection of a world that had rejected her, of a society that had laughed at her ideas. Emma no longer saw it as a place of opportunity. It had become the battleground for her final stand. What started as a fight for justice had evolved into something much darker, and Emma, lost in her own rage, could no longer differentiate between the fight for equality and the destructive path her thoughts had taken. Emma's anger began to consume her completely, a fire that burned hotter and brighter the more she reflected on the rejection and mockery she had faced. Each snide remark, each dismissive laugh from her classmates only deepened her bitterness. She had once believed in the power of words and ideas, thinking that if she could only explain herself clearly enough, others would see the truth in her words. But that belief had been shattered piece by piece with every sneer and sarcastic comment. Now those words seemed pointless, impotent, in the face of the constant ridicule she endured. The realization that she would never be truly understood by her peers began to eat away at her, pushing her further into a spiral of anger and despair. It wasn't just the mocking that hurt anymore. It was the isolation that came with it. Emma felt alone in the world, trapped in a society that refused to listen to her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her voice, her beliefs had been ignored at every turn. Her attempts to bring change, to challenge the status quo, had been rejected, and she had been cast aside as just another angry teenager. She was tired of being dismissed, tired of being invisible. The more she thought about it, the more the idea of taking action took root. Emma began to fixate on the idea of violence as a way to make herself heard. It was a horrifying thought, but one that she couldn't seem to shake. It was the only way, she believed, to force her classmates to understand the depth of her frustration, the urgency of the issues she cared about. Slowly, methodically, the plan began to form in her mind. She had always been a quiet and calculating person, someone who preferred to think things through before acting. This time, she would not let her anger control her. Instead, she would harness it, channeling it into a carefully executed plan. Emma knew the school better than anyone. She knew the hallways, the classrooms, the times when the halls would be crowded and when the students would be distracted. Her years of observation had made her an expert in her surroundings. And more importantly, Emma knew about the school's weapons storage, an oversight by the administration that had gone unnoticed by most. She had seen the room where the school kept its emergency supplies, including rifles and knives, during a routine tour in the past. It was supposed to be a secure area, but the lax oversight had made it easy for Emma to figure out a way to access it. Growing up around guns and knives, Emma had always known how to handle them. Her family, though not overtly violent, had taught her how to defend herself in a world that sometimes felt hostile and unfair. She had never imagined using them for anything other than protection. But now, with the weight of everything she had endured, with the relentless bullying and rejection, the idea of using them for something more, something that would force others to see her, began to take root. Emma could feel herself becoming numb to the reality of what she was planning. Her thoughts, once filled with ideals of justice and equality, were now consumed by a singular goal: to make her peers understand the depth of her anger, the pain of being unheard. The more Emma thought about it, the more her plan began to take shape. She envisioned the day, the moment when she would walk through the school halls, her classmates oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. It would be during a busy time, during lunch or between classes, when the noise of students talking and laughing would drown out any signs of what was coming. She knew that her classmates wouldn't see it coming. They would be too absorbed in their lives, too wrapped up in their own concerns to notice the change in her, to notice that Emma had gone from the girl who fought for justice with words to the girl who had decided that words were no longer enough. The more she thought about it, the more the idea of violence seemed like the only way to make them understand. Emma's obsession with the plan grew every day. It was the only thing that made her feel in control, the only thing that gave her a sense of purpose. The more she obsessed over the details, the more the outside world faded away. Her schoolwork, her relationships, Everything else in her life became secondary to the single-minded goal of making her classmates feel the same pain she had endured. She no longer cared about her education or her future. She was consumed by the need for revenge. The girl who had once walked through the halls with a fire of passion in her eyes, eager to educate others about equality and justice, was now a shadow of her former self. The fire had been replaced with cold, calculated rage. She had become a ticking time bomb, her rage simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. As the days passed, Emma grew more distant from everything and everyone around her. She stopped attending the protests she had once been so passionate about, stopped trying to engage in conversations about feminism or equality. It was as though the very ideals she had once fought for had abandoned her, leaving her with nothing but a deep sense of bitterness and betrayal. The people she had once called her friends no longer seemed to matter to her. The mocking, the laughter, and the endless rejection had stripped away any sense of connection she had to them. In her mind, they were no longer just classmates. They were enemies. They were the ones who had made her feel small, made her feel like her voice didn't matter. And in Emma's mind, they would pay the price for that. Her plan, though meticulously calculated, was born from a deep well of pain and frustration. Emma's once bright ideals of justice had been overshadowed by her need to prove herself, to make the world see her for who she was, for what she believed in. The world had rejected her. Now it was her turn to make it listen, to make her peers understand the consequences of their laughter, their mockery, and their indifference. She no longer cared about the cost. The destruction of her own sense of self, her sense of humanity, had already taken its toll. Now Emma was willing to sacrifice everything else to make sure that the world understood the depths of her pain. As she approached the day she had been planning for weeks, Emma felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear and doubt that had once plagued her were gone. She had made up her mind. There was no turning back now. She knew what she had to do, and as the clock ticked down to the day of the attack, she felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. What was once a quiet voice calling for justice and equality had now become the roar of revenge. Emma had crossed the line, and there was no way back. She had become a weapon, a force driven by anger, and she was ready to strike. The fateful day arrived, one that no one at the school would ever forget. It began like any other, with students chatting in the hallways, laughing between classes, and gossiping about the latest rumors. The air was filled with the usual buzz of adolescent energy, a mix of excitement, boredom, and anticipation for the weekend. Emma moved through the school like any other student, blending in with the crowd. On the outside, she appeared to be just another face in the sea of teenagers. But inside, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, frustration, and anticipation. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, her thoughts consumed with the belief that the time had come to make her classmates understand her pain. As the bell rang to signal the start of lunch break, Emma's heart began to race. Her bag, once innocuous and filled with school supplies, now contained the tools she had carefully placed inside that morning. It was a feeling of purpose and dread all at once. She moved toward the cafeteria, her steps quick but controlled, her face set in a cold expression. As she walked past the students who had taunted and ridiculed her, she could feel their eyes on her, but none of them knew what was about to happen. The faces that had laughed at her, the voices that had mocked her feminist views, were oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. Once she entered the cafeteria, Emma's focus narrowed. The once bustling space, filled with the noise of students eating and talking, now felt surreal, as if time had slowed. With swift, calculated movements, she began her attack, targeting those who had mocked her the most, the ones who had belittled her for her beliefs. They had made her feel small, insignificant, and rejected for standing up for what she believed in. In her mind, this was not just an act of revenge, it was a cleansing. She had convinced herself that this violence was necessary to make them understand, to make them feel the weight of the injustice she had been subjected to. The violence erupted in seconds. Students screamed and scrambled for cover, their chairs crashing to the floor, their lunch trays forgotten in the chaos. The once vibrant cafeteria turned into a scene of utter terror, a place of refuge now transformed into a battleground. Emma moved with purpose, her actions swift and determined. The faculty rushed toward the cafeteria, but by the time they arrived, the damage had already been done. Several students lay dead or gravely wounded, victims of Emma's fury, and the school was plunged into chaos. The aftermath was horrifying. The bloodshed, the screams, and the panic left everyone in disbelief. How could someone so young, so misunderstood, have spiraled into such violence? Emma, once a girl who fought for equality and justice, was now a murderer. Her face, blank and emotionless, revealed little of the storm that had consumed her. The girl who had once been driven by a desire to educate and advocate for change had become a symbol of tragedy. Her attack marked the end of her story and the beginning of a new chapter filled with questions, debates, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The community was left to grapple with the shocking realization that no one had seen the signs, no one had noticed the pain she had been hiding. The tragedy left scars that would never fully heal, and the question of why Emma had resorted to such extreme measures would haunt everyone who had known her. In the aftermath of the attack, the community was left reeling, trapped in a haze of disbelief and grief. The once bustling school, a place where students had laughed, learned, and formed memories, now stood as a silent monument to the unimaginable violence that had occurred. News spread quickly, with each new detail about the tragedy sinking deeper into the hearts of everyone who heard it. The questions were endless, unrelenting, gnawing at the edges of everyone's consciousness. How could this happen? How could someone so young, so seemingly ordinary, turn into a figure capable of such horrific violence? The shock was palpable. Not just within the walls of the school, but throughout the entire community. It seemed as if no one could understand how things had escalated to this point, how a girl who had once been just another face in the crowd had ended up turning her rage into such a catastrophic act. The media quickly seized on the story, diving into every available detail of Emma's life, attempting to uncover the puzzle pieces that might explain what had gone wrong. Reporters and journalists flocked to the town, eager to tell the story of the girl who had gone from being a passionate advocate for equality to a murderer. With each new interview and piece of information, the picture of Emma began to form. She was a girl who had felt unseen, misunderstood, and rejected. Her feminist ideals, once a source of strength, had become a point of contention, something that set her apart from her peers. Her rejection by her classmates, the constant mocking, and the ridicule she had endured over the years were now seen as potential catalysts for her violent outburst. The media painted a picture of a girl who had never found her place in a world that refused to accept her. Experts were quick to weigh in, offering their psychological assessments of Emma's actions. Some pointed to the impact of years of bullying, claiming that the cruelty she had faced from her classmates had built up over time, festering in her mind until it became something uncontrollable. Others highlighted the societal pressures she had faced, growing up in an environment where her beliefs set her apart from everyone around her. These pressures, combined with a lack of support and understanding, seemed to create the perfect storm for Emma's internal struggles. Her inability to find an outlet for her frustration, her anger at the world and at the people who had rejected her, had slowly been transformed into an obsession with revenge. The experts couldn't deny the role of isolation, of Emma's inability to connect with others who could understand her. It was clear that the tragedy hadn't come from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of internalized pain and rejection. As the investigation into Emma's motives continued, the school and the community were left to deal with the emotional wreckage of the attack. Friends, classmates, and teachers found themselves grappling with the incomprehensible loss of so many young lives. The school that had once been a place of learning and growth was now a scar on the community, a symbol of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. The grief was overwhelming, not just because of the lives lost, but because no one had seen the signs. The same students who had mocked Emma, the same teachers who had dismissed her struggles, were left to question how they had missed the warning signs of someone on the brink of despair. In the aftermath of the violence, the answers seemed impossible to find. Emma's life, once filled with the promise of future possibilities, was now defined by the violence she had unleashed. The tragedy that had claimed her classmates and teachers was a result of her brokenness, her inability to reconcile the anger she felt with the world around her. The true reasons for her actions, the deep-rooted pain, the isolation, the rejection, were lost in the whirlwind of violence. No one could fully comprehend what Emma had been going through, what she had been carrying inside for so long. Her story became a symbol of the pain that could lie beneath the surface, of the devastating consequences of ignoring the struggles of those around us. The school, the community, and the world would never be the same again. The tragedy left behind not just physical scars, but emotional wounds that would take years to heal, if they ever truly would.